The aroma of ginger and garlic drifted from the kitchen, a familiar and comforting scent that always greeted David after work. He shrugged off his suit jacket, the weight of another day at the accounting firm instantly easing within the familiar embrace of his home. His mother, Malin, sat in her recliner, her face etched with concentration as she followed a Tai Chi video on the television. "Ma," David said softly, approaching her. "How are the legs feeling today?" Malin smiled, a network of wrinkles crinkling around her eyes. "A little stiff, but better than yesterday. This young man on the TV, he knows what he's doing." David chuckled. He probably has a team of physical therapists behind the scenes. He knelt beside her, gently taking her hands. "Let's do a few stretches, okay? Just like Dr. Lee showed us." Malin winced slightly as David guided her through the exercises, his touch careful and patient. He knew her limits, the precise point where discomfort turned into pain. He counted slowly in Mandarin, his voice a soothing rhythm against the soft hum of the house. "Good, Ma," he praised after a few minutes. "You're doing great." His father, Jayan, shuffled into the living room, leaning heavily on his cane. The recent hip surgery had taken its toll, leaving him weaker and more dependent than David had ever seen him. "Dinner almost ready?" Jayan asked, his voice raspy. "I'm starving." "Almost, Ba," David replied, helping his mother settle back into her chair. "Just a few more minutes. We're having steamed fish and bok choy." Jayan's eyes lit up. "Your mother's steamed fish is the best in the world." He settled onto the sofa, a contented sigh escaping his lips. The dining room table, a sturdy oak piece that had been in the family for generations, was set with their usual care. Simple white plates, chopsticks, and small bowls for rice. They ate family style, passing dishes and sharing stories from their day. David listened as his father recounted a humorous anecdote about his physical therapy session, while his mother described the latest episode of her favorite Korean drama. Even his wife, Sarah, usually quiet during the week, chimed in with a funny story from her work as a librarian. This was their sanctuary, this simple act of breaking bread together. A refuge from the outside world, from the pressures and anxieties that constantly gnawed at David. It was a space where they could be themselves, where they could laugh and share and simply be together. The evening unfolded in its familiar cadence. After dinner, David helped his father with his evening medication, then settled in with Sarah to watch a movie. His parents retired to their rooms, the soft glow of their bedside lamps visible through the open doorways. Later, David checked in on them one last time, making sure they were comfortable and had everything they needed. The house settled into a quiet hum, the sounds of suburban life filtering through the closed windows. The distant bark of a dog, the faint rumble of a passing car, the gentle whir of the refrigerator. These were the sounds of normalcy, of peace, of home. The following days blurred into a comforting routine. David woke early, made breakfast for his parents, and headed to work. He returned home in the evening to the familiar smells and sounds of his family. He helped his mother with her exercises, listened to his father's stories, and shared quiet moments with Sarah. Weekends were spent tending to the garden, a small patch of green that David's father had cultivated with meticulous care for decades. They grew vegetables, herbs, and a vibrant array of flowers. It was a place of tranquility, a place where David could lose himself in the simple act of nurturing life. Sometimes David would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges of their suburban neighborhood. It was an idyllic scene, a picture-perfect representation of the American dream. He loved the quiet streets, the friendly neighbors, the sense of community. He never imagined that this peaceful existence could be threatened, that someone would try to disrupt the harmony of their home. But Cynthia Hargrove had changed everything, her petty grievances and blatant disregard for their family's well-being casting a long shadow over their suburban sanctuary. And David, usually so averse to confrontation, found a simmering anger building within him, a protective instinct that was demanding to be unleashed. Cynthia Hargrove advanced with the deliberate air of a seasoned hunter surveying her territory. Her eyes narrowed as she appraised Mrs. Davison's celebrated roses, then she tapped a lacquered nail against the immaculate fence. Too saccharine, David thought, peering through the gap in his curtains. For Cynthia, everything veered into excess, too boisterous, too vibrant, too lived-in and messy. He'd come to anticipate her arrival, the languid creep of her golf cart, the judging glint in her eyes as she scanned lawns as if they were contenders at a garden show. Today, her scrutiny lingered on his somewhat neglected patch of impatience. He winced internally, certain his gardening skills were about to be deemed substandard. An hour passed, and then the official missive from the HOA landed like a bureaucratic iceberg, crisp, white, and faintly redolent of corporate malaise. Violation of Bylaw 314, it proclaimed in a font dripping with veiled hostility. Multi-generational living. David reread it, his blood turning to ice water. Bylaw 314. He vaguely recalled its mention during one of the excruciating HOA meetings he artfully dodged, something about preserving community identity and averting undue burden on shared resources. At the time, it had seemed like pointless administrative jargon. Now it was a loaded weapon aimed directly at his family's heart. The notice dictated his parents permanently relinquish their residence within the month. Noncompliance would incur escalating penalties and possible legal action. David crushed the paper in his fist, visions of his mother's delicate hands and his father's measured gait haunting him. Relocating them wasn't merely inconvenient, it presented a logistical and medical nightmare. Memory stung. Mrs. Henderson, a few houses down, had been served a comparable order last year for displaying unruly holiday embellishments, a slightly overzealous inflatable Santa. David had witnessed powerless as Cynthia orchestrated its gradual public collapse, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face. He had imagined naively that she had reached the apogee of her petty autocracy. He'd been mistaken. He scanned the directive once more. Occupancy restrictions, noise complaints. Increased wear and tear on common areas. The accusations rang hollow, insulting even. His parents were hardly a disruptive element. His mother mostly knitted in the sunroom, while his father's convalescence involved quiet reading and gentle strolls. The wear and tear was likely attributable to foraging squirrels. David ran a hand through his hair, a familiar coil of anxiety tightening in his gut. He loathed direct conflict. He favored rationale, measured debate, amicable resolution. But Cynthia Hargrove didn't traffic in rationale. She reveled in influence, the capacity to dictate the shade of your blooms and the occupants of your abode. He caught sight of his father, progressing slowly down the hallway with his walker, a determined set to his jaw. David realized he couldn't yield. This was not about impatience or inflatable yard decorations. This concerned family belonging permanence. He unfurled the Hargrove edict, smoothing out the creases with meticulous care. He required a strategy, and he needed it quickly. His mind raced, hunting for a vulnerability, a crack in Cynthia's meticulously constructed facade of rules and regulations. He recalled an article he'd encountered online about her house, her obsession, the paragon of architectural precision that was perpetually on display. An idea, audacious and wicked, bloomed in his mind. He reached for his mobile. David squared his shoulders as he approached Cynthia Hargrove's perfectly manicured lawn. His wife, Sarah, squeezed his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. The air hung thick with the cloying scent of her meticulously placed rose bushes, each bloom a testament to Cynthia's iron-fisted control. He half expected a robotic lawn gnome to pop up and demand their HOA credentials. The imposing modern structure of her house, all glass and steel angles, seemed to sneer at the more traditional homes in the development. It was like a spaceship had landed in Pleasantville. Cynthia greeted them at the door, her expression a carefully crafted mask of professional courtesy. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, emphasizing the sharp angles of her face. She ushered them into a sterile, minimalist office, devoid of any personal touches. Not a single framed photo, no quirky paperweights, just a sleek desk and two uncomfortable-looking chairs. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth, "thank you for coming in. I trust you received my notice regarding the occupancy violation." David took a seat, feeling the chill of the metal chair seep through his slacks. "Yes, we did, Cynthia, and we hope to explain the situation." Sarah jumped in, her voice softer. "David's parents require full-time care. His mother has limited mobility due to arthritis, and his father is recovering from a serious surgery. It's simply not feasible for them to live independently." Cynthia steepled her fingers, her gaze unwavering. "While I sympathize with your situation, the bylaws are clear. They state occupancy limits based on household size and are designed to maintain property values and prevent overcrowding. The presence of your parents constitutes a violation." David felt a slow burn of anger rising in his chest. "Overcrowding? Cynthia, our house is a standard 4-bedroom. My parents occupy one of those bedrooms. How can that possibly be considered overcrowding?" "The bylaws do not specify which rooms are occupied, Mr. Chen. They simply state the maximum number of residents per square footage. Your household exceeds that limit." She tapped a manicured nail against a thick binder on her desk. Regulation 3.2, subsection B, paragraph 7, if you'd like to review. Sarah tried a different approach. But surely there's some flexibility here, a compassionate exception, perhaps. We can provide medical documentation, doctor's notes, anything you need to understand the situation. Cynthia's expression remained unchanged. I understand that you believe your situation warrants special consideration. However, the HOA must apply the bylaws consistently and fairly to all residents. To grant an exception in your case would set a precedent and open the door to further violations. She paused, her eyes glinting. We wouldn't want the neighborhood devolving into some sort of boarding house, would we? David's jaw tightened. He could feel his patience wearing thin. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. So you're saying that despite the medical necessities, despite the fact that we're providing care for our aging parents, you're just going to stick to the letter of the law? The bylaws are in place for a reason, Mr. Chen. They protect the interests of the community. I am simply upholding my responsibility as HOA president. She picked up a pen and began to tap it against the desk, a small, rhythmic sound that grated on David's nerves. He glanced at Sarah, seeing the disappointment etched on her face. He knew they were getting nowhere. He pushed back his chair, the metal scraping against the floor. Fine, he said, his voice dangerously level. We'll see you at the next board meeting. I think the rest of the community might be interested to hear how you define protecting the interests when it comes to elderly people needing care. Cynthia merely nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. I look forward to it, Mr. Chen. As they walked back to their car, the perfect lawn seemed to mock them. The sterile air hung heavy. David turned to Sarah. Well, that was about as productive as arguing with a brick wall. Sarah sighed. She's just so unfeeling. Unfeeling, she's a cyborg programmed to enforce HOA bylaws. I wouldn't be surprised if she runs on premium unleaded. He paused, a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. But don't worry, I've got a few ideas of my own on how to protect the interests of this community. The lamp threw a hard-edged circle of light across the table, a stark stage for the paper mountain range. David kneaded his gritty eyelids, the ghost of ink lingering on his fingertips. Hours bled into each other, fueled by stale coffee and the slow burn of indignation that had finally caught flame. Cynthia Hargrove, with her immaculate flower beds and pronouncements delivered from on high, had crossed a line. The HOA rules were a tangled thicket, a verbose, poorly organized document seemingly drafted by a committee powered by caffeine and anxiety. Property value retention, acceptable flora, decibel restrictions. The headings swam before his eyes. He felt like a paleontologist, brushing away layers of sediment to uncover a single, crucial fossil. He highlighted sections, then discarded them. Occupancy parameters addressed only the number of unrelated adults per square footage, a point his household easily cleared. Disturbance clauses were nebulous, citing infringements that could justifiably disrupt neighborhood tranquility. Justifiable, of course, rested squarely in the hands of the HOA, meaning Cynthia Hargrove. A section on structural changes snagged his attention. It meticulously outlined the protocol for submitting blueprints for expansions, fences, even garden sheds. Page after tedious page devoted to the precise shade of greige allowed for exterior walls. Yet not a syllable regarding familial constructs, not a breath about multi-generational living. David leaned back, a slow grin igniting his face. He scrolled back through the digital labyrinth, rechecking, verifying, confirming. He even initiated a keyword search. Generation, family, elder. 0, a gaping abyss where Cynthia presumed to hold sway. The truth landed like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about regulations. It was Cynthia's personal biases cloaked in the guise of governance. Her obsession with manicured perfection had metastasized into something far more sinister, a hunger to control not just curb appeal but the very essence of her neighbors' lives. He pictured Cynthia, enthroned in her glass house, surveying her kingdom with smug satisfaction. The vision hardened his resolve. He wouldn't let her win. He wouldn't allow her to force his parents out based on nothing more than her own warped sense of order. He rose and stretched, his spine popping in protest. The digital bylaws loomed from the screen, a testament to bureaucratic bloat and the insidious power of homeowners' associations. But within that chaos, he'd found his leverage. The absence of regulation was, in this instance, the regulation itself. He brewed another cup, the robust scent permeating the air. He needed a strategy, a way to expose Cynthia's flagrant abuse of authority. The spider prank had been a minor victory, a childish act of joyful defiance, but this demanded something more calculated, something undeniable. He recalled the articles about Cynthia, staged open houses, the endless parade of strangers wandering through her meticulously designed interior. He thought of the architecture blog that had all but canonized her modernist masterpiece. He smiled. Information, he realized, was a potent weapon, and Cynthia Hargrove had unwittingly left her vulnerable. The cream-colored envelope felt heavier than it should have. David recognized the HOA logo instantly, a stylized oak tree encircled by the words Harmony Glens, preserving our community. He hadn't expected them to move this fast. He'd only left the spider exhibit 3 days ago. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. Inside, the letter was terse and formal, a legalistic screed riddled with citations from the HOA bylaws. The gist: violation of occupancy limits, disturbance of the peace attributed to unspecified anxiety therapy methods, and damage to property values. The penalty: a daily fine of $250, retroactive to the date of the initial warning, $7,500, just like that. He slumped into his desk chair, the weight of the paper crushing him. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a siege. He massaged his temples, trying to quell the nascent headache blooming behind his eyes. He knew he should have expected it, should have prepared himself for Cynthia's vindictive streak. But a part of him had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the spider incident would have embarrassed her enough to back down. He showed the letter to his parents that evening. His mother's face crumpled, the fine lines around her eyes deepening into worried furrows. "Oh, David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are we going to do?" His father, usually a pillar of stoic calm, gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white. "That woman, she's trying to bankrupt us." He looked at David, his gaze filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "We can't let her win." David tried to reassure them, forcing a smile that felt brittle and false. "We'll figure it out. We'll talk to a lawyer. Maybe there's some loophole, some legal precedent we can use." He didn't sound convincing even to himself. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls, hurried meetings, and endless scrolling through legal websites. He neglected his work, his emails piling up, deadlines looming like storm clouds. His boss, usually understanding, gave him a pointed look and a thinly veiled warning about his declining performance. Sleep became a luxury he could barely afford. He lay awake at night, the digital clock on his nightstand flashing the relentless march of time, each minute ticking away another few dollars into Cynthia's coffers. He felt trapped, suffocated by the relentless pressure. One evening, while trying to decipher a particularly dense legal document, he snapped. He threw the papers across the room, the scattered pages fluttering to the floor like fallen leaves. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers tangling in the disheveled strands. He felt a surge of anger, a raw, burning rage that threatened to consume him. "This isn't fair," he muttered, his voice tight with emotion. "She can't just do this. She can't just ruin our lives." He looked at the framed photograph on his desk, a picture of his family taken years ago when they were all younger, happier, carefree. A wave of protectiveness washed over him. He couldn't let Cynthia take that away from them. He wouldn't. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It was time to fight back, to stop playing by Cynthia's rules. He needed to find someone who knew how to play dirty. Someone who understood the art of escalation. The bell above the door of Lou's diner chimed as David entered, the smell of frying bacon a familiar comfort. He spotted Mark in their usual booth by the window, a half-eaten stack of pancakes and a mug of black coffee in front of him. Mark looked up, his perpetually surprised eyebrows arching even higher. "Davy, you look like you wrestled a badger." David slid into the booth, the vinyl squeaking under his weight. "Badger might have been easier, it's Cynthia Hargrove." Mark chuckled, a sound like gravel tumbling down a hill. "Ah, the HOA queen, still riding your case about your folks." David nodded, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Threatening fines, legal action, it's relentless. I don't know what to do, Mark. I feel helpless." Mark sopped up some syrup with a piece of pancake. Helplessness is overrated, especially when dealing with, well, let's just say Cynthia ain't exactly known for her humility. "You know her?" David asked, surprised. "Know of her," Mark corrected. "Word travels fast in this town, especially when it involves someone who thinks their house is worthy of architectural digests." He took a swig of his coffee, a glint in his eye. "I've done a few preventative maintenance gigs in the neighborhood. Cynthia, she's got open houses practically every weekend. brags about her smart home this, eco-friendly that, thinks she's living in some futuristic utopia. David frowned. Open houses, why? Vanity, pure and simple, Mark said, waving his fork dismissively. She loves the attention, thinks she's a trendsetter, every tech blog, every home tour, she's gotta be the star. He leaned in conspiratorially. Place is practically a museum. Everything's voice-activated, automated, monitored, you name it. David's mind started to race. Open houses, every weekend, vanity, a museum. A plan, audacious and maybe a little crazy, began to form in his head. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice even. So these open houses, are they like for anyone? Mark shrugged. Pretty much. She advertises them all over. Free cookies, fancy coffee, the whole 9 yards, thinks it impresses people. He paused, studying David's face. Why the sudden interest in Cynthia's social calendar? David forced a casual smile. Just curious, trying to understand the enemy. Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it, but he didn't press. All right, Davy, just be careful. Cynthia's got connections and she doesn't like being crossed. David nodded, already lost in thought. He pictured Cynthia's pristine, glass-walled living room, the sleek minimalist furniture, the gleaming surfaces. And then he pictured something else, small, dark shapes crawling across those gleaming surfaces. The contrast was almost too perfect. He pushed aside his uneaten breakfast. Mark, you know about arachnid relocation, right? Mark's eyes widened. Relocation, you mean you're thinking? He grinned, a flash of mischief lighting up his face. Davy, you sly dog, I knew you had it in you. He leaned back, chuckling. Black Widow's, bold choice. Not dangerous ones necessarily, David clarified quickly. Just visually impactful, and definitely not illegal. Of course, Mark said, still grinning. Totally educational, for anxiety therapy maybe. David managed a weak smile, something like that. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, but the thought of finally pushing back against Cynthia, of reclaiming his family's peace, was too tempting to resist. He stood up, pulling out his wallet. Thanks, Mark, for the information, and maybe, soon, for your professional services. Mark winked. Anytime, Davy, anytime. Just remember, plausible deniability is your best friend. He watched David leave, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. The HOA was about to get a whole lot more interesting. So you're sure about this, David? Mark asked, leaning back in his creaky office chair. The springs groaned in protest. Sunlight streamed through the dusty window, illuminating motes dancing in the air. David fidgeted with the edge of a coaster, avoiding Mark's gaze. She's not going to stop, Mark. You saw the letter. Daily fines, legal action, all because she doesn't like the look of my family. He finally met Mark's eyes, a flicker of steel beneath the usual mildness. Mark nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. All right, Black Widows it is, just so we're clear, David. These aren't toys, they bite, people get hurt. This is more than just a prank, and it could backfire. I understand, David said firmly. But she's hurting my family, Mark. What choice do I have? It's not like I'm unleashing them into the wild. They'll be in terrariums, secure, educational even. He winced at the last word, the irony thick in the air. Mark snorted. Educational, right, like a cobra in a glass cage is educational, but whatever, your call, my friend, your call. He swiveled back to his cluttered desk, a chaotic landscape of jars, tools, and half-dissected insect specimens. I'll need a few days and some supplies. This ain't exactly catching butterflies. 3 days later, David found himself bumping along a dirt road in Mark's battered pickup truck. The air hung thick and heavy with the scent of dry grass and something vaguely chemical. Mark, perched behind the wheel, hummed a tuneless melody, his eyes scanning the scrubby landscape. Prime widow habitat, he announced, pulling the truck to a stop beside a crumbling stone wall. Old, dry, plenty of hiding places. He reached behind the seat and pulled out a well-worn backpack. Gloves are in the side pocket. And don't even think about touching anything without them. David carefully pulled on a pair of thick leather gloves, feeling a prickle of unease. The air seemed still and silent, broken only by the buzz of unseen insects. He followed Mark as he clambered over the wall, disappearing into a tangle of weeds and overgrown bushes. Mark moved with a practiced grace, his eyes sharp and focused. He carefully overturned rocks and peered into crevices, his movements deliberate and precise. Aha! He exclaimed softly, pointing with a gloved finger. David approached cautiously. Nestled in a dark corner beneath a flat stone was a small, intricate web, and at its center a glossy black spider with the telltale crimson hourglass gleaming on its abdomen. It was smaller than David expected, but undeniably menacing. Mark produced a small glass jar from his backpack, carefully positioning it near the web. With a quick flick of his wrist, he dislodged the spider and coaxed it into the jar. He secured the lid with a practiced twist. "One down," he said, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. 29 to go. Over the next few hours, David watched in a mixture of fascination and horror as Mark systematically collected the spiders. Each one was carefully captured and placed in its own individual terrarium, complete with a small piece of bark and a water source. Mark handled them with a respect that bordered on reverence, murmuring softly as he worked. Back in Mark's workshop, the terrariums were arranged on a long table, the black widows visible through the glass. The sight of so many of the spiders, so close, made the hairs on David's arms stand on end. Mark pointed out the details of their construction. Good ventilation, secure lids, and each one has enough space to spin a decent web. He tapped a terrarium lightly. "These little ladies are going to be living in style." He glanced at David, a knowing look in his eye. "Ready to unleash your educational pets, David." The key rattled in the lock, a metallic counterpoint to David's frantic heartbeat. Mark, ever the picture of unflappable weirdness, jiggled the doorknob. "Relax, David. We're practically invited guests, remember? She wants asterisk people in her house." Inside, the air was sterile, scented with something vaguely industrial and expensive. Light streamed in through massive windows, illuminating minimalist furniture and gleaming surfaces. David swallowed, clutching the handle of the terrarium containing a particularly plump black widow. "I still feel like we're committing a felony." Mark snorted, "Felony of being mildly inconveniencing. I think we're good. Besides, think of it as performance art." He gestured around the pristine living room. "This place is begging for a little chaos." They worked quickly, placing the terrariums strategically. One on a floating shelf beside a stark white sculpture, another nestled amongst a collection of art books on a glass coffee table, a third partially obscured by a designer throw draped over a futuristic armchair. The spiders, thankfully, remained largely still, their glossy black bodies gleaming in the artificial light. Each terrarium bore a small, neatly printed label. "Since you love forcing people out of their homes, we figured you'd want to meet some new residents," David read aloud from the label on the terrarium he'd just placed. His voice trembled slightly. Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "Perfect. A touch of passive aggression, a dash of social commentary. What's not to love?" He adjusted the terrarium containing Agnes, his favorite widow, so it caught the light just so. "Now, let's disappear before the hordes arrive." Outside, they loitered a block away, watching the street fill with cars. David paced, his anxiety escalating. What if someone gets bitten? What if she calls the police? "David, they're in terrariums. And besides, Black Widow bites are rarely fatal, mostly just a lot of unpleasantness. Think of it as a character-building experience for her guests." Mark grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. The first guests began to arrive, a mix of curious neighbors, aspiring architects, and bored socialites. David watched them enter Cynthia's gleaming fortress, his stomach churning. Then it began. A high-pitched shriek pierced the air, followed by a chorus of gasps and murmurs. A woman in a designer dress bolted from the house, her face contorted in horror. "Spiders, there are spiders everywhere." More people poured out onto the lawn, some laughing nervously, others visibly shaken. A man in a tweed jacket pointed a trembling finger at the house. "Did you see the size of those things?" Cynthia emerged, her perfectly coiffed hair slightly askew, her face a mask of disbelief. "What is going on?" she demanded, her voice tight with suppressed fury. The crowd parted, revealing the source of the commotion. A woman stood frozen in the doorway, staring wide-eyed at the terrarium on the coffee table. "Is that a Black Widow?" she whispered. Cynthia's carefully constructed facade crumbled. She rushed forward, trying to usher people back inside, her voice rising in pitch. "It's just a misunderstanding. They're educational displays, a quirky design choice." No one was buying it. A chorus of horrified gasps erupted as more people spotted the strategically placed terrariums. One woman fainted. A man started filming the scene with his phone, narrating the unfolding chaos with gleeful amusement. Cynthia, her face now flushed crimson, frantically began to gather the terrariums, her hands shaking. She dropped one, the glass shattering on the pristine floor, sending a collective scream through the crowd. Agnes, temporarily free, scurried under the futuristic armchair. David watched, a strange mixture of guilt and satisfaction washing over him. It was a disaster, a complete and utter spectacle, but it was also effective. Mark nudged him. "Showtime, David. Let's go claim our educational pets." As they approached the house, David took a deep breath. He may not be comfortable with confrontation, but he was done being pushed around. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. Crimson and azure emergency lights splashed across the meticulously kept lawns, an erratic light show exposing every blade of grass. David, a study in serenity amidst the swirling chaos, stood on his porch, hands buried in his pockets. A gaggle of reporters elbowed each other for the prime shot, lenses trained on Cynthia's residence, now demarcated by stark yellow tape. A low thrum of neighborhood gossip, a mixture of concern and schadenfreude, filled the air. "Mr. Chen." A fresh-faced officer approached, clipboard in hand. "Could you clarify the spider situation?" David straightened, adopting a tone of disarming candor. "Certainly, officer. As I mentioned, these arachnids serve an educational purpose. They're part of a unique exposure therapy regimen for my anxiety." He indicated Cynthia's house with a casual wave. "Recent events have been unsettling, and observing the intricate societal structures of these creatures offers a much-needed sense of equilibrium." The officer blinked, processing. "Right, exposure therapy and the enclosures." "Necessary precautions," David assured him smoothly. "Safety is paramount, of course. Each specimen is clearly identified with its taxonomic nomenclature and behavioral patterns. Quite enlightening, really. Perhaps Ms. Hargrove's guests gained some unexpected knowledge." Mark Olson, lounging against David's railing, chuckled. "He's got a point, officer. Beats the usual daytime drama." Sensing a developing narrative, the press corps pivoted, their cameras now focused on David. A reporter, brandishing a microphone, shouldered her way forward. "Mr. Chen, is it true you deliberately introduced these spiders into Ms. Hargrove's home?" David met the camera's gaze, feigning mild surprise. "Deliberately? Hardly. They were invited participants, an element of the open house experience. A singular opportunity for prospective buyers to assess all aspects of the property, including its potential inhabitants." He paused, a ghost of a smile gracing his lips. Perhaps Ms. Hargrove should have consulted an entomologist beforehand. Within hours, the narrative went viral. Spidergate, HOA hell, and arachnid justice lit up social media. Images of the spider-infested living room spread like wildfire, each spawning a fresh wave of satirical memes. Cynthia's carefully constructed facade was crumbling like ancient plaster. The HOA board meeting was a pressure cooker, held within the sterile confines of the community clubhouse. David, with Mark at his side, occupied a back-row seat, observing Cynthia as she fought to defend her position. Her voice, typically so assertive and commanding, now sounded reedy and strained. "This is an egregious breach of privacy," she declared, her face a mask of indignation. "Mr. Chen's actions were calculated and malicious. He has brought disrepute upon our community." Old Mrs. Henderson, a resident for over 4 decades, remembering when the area was still orange groves, rose to her feet. "Disrepute. Disrepute is attempting to tear a family apart when they need each other most. Disrepute is perverting bylaws for petty vengeance. Disrepute is cultivating more spiders than friends." The room erupted in applause. Even the board members, normally so obsequious to Cynthia, appeared ill at ease. The vote was swift and decisive. Cynthia Hargrove was ousted from her position as HOA president. That evening, David's parents, radiating happiness, helped him prepare a celebratory meal. The fragrant steam of his mother's dumplings filled the home, a familiar aroma of restored normalcy. "You handled that wonderfully, son," his father said, clapping him on the shoulder. "A touch unorthodox, perhaps, but undeniably effective." "I only wanted to safeguard you both," David replied, a rare moment of heartfelt emotion. The following morning, a moving truck lumbered up to Cynthia's residence. The shades were drawn, and the once immaculate landscaping appeared unkempt. The news raced through the neighborhood. Cynthia was departing. David watched from his porch as the truck groaned its way down the street, disappearing around the bend. A fleeting twinge of something resembling compassion washed over him, quickly superseded by a profound sense of liberation. The neighborhood was once again tranquil, the only sound the soft susurrus of leaves in the trees. He knew he'd stirred the pot, challenged unspoken conventions. But he'd also protected his family, and ultimately that was paramount. He glanced at Mark, who offered him an acknowledging nod. "So," Mark inquired, "ready for a return to the mundane? I understand the local butterfly conservatory is hosting a migration event." David grinned, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Butterflies, eh? Now those are the kind of educational companions I can embrace.